what is it that we can learn or relearn about being indigenous that might help us to manage our own interconnected lives, our businesses, and the living systems around us? How can we do all of that more effectively? And that really leads me on to introducing Marcus, who thinks about these things and has thought about these things much more intensively and coherently than I. Marcus is a radical natural entrepreneur, researcher, and writer. He's the co-founder of New Foundation Farms, a regenerative farming business with nature as a shareholder, and also of the Holos Earth Project. He also writes as the quantum poet and publishes on his blog, foolsjourney.me, where you can find out about his belief that there is always a possibility for human beings to become a beneficial keystone species on planet Earth. So this attitude guides him in everything he does. He was born in Ireland, educated in Germany. He now lives on a small holding on Dartmoor, close to where I live here. And he is exploring ways of becoming indigenous to the land there. So over to you, Marcus.
Hi, thank you, Richard. I actually want to pick up just quickly before I go to what else I have to say to this notion of positive thinking. And somehow I had the feeling you were saying that positive thinking may also need to be light thinking. And I would say, I wanted to grab that immediately and say that one of my observations is that the way we live so often assumes that feeling is bad thinking. Whereas I was going to say that thinking often is bad feeling, and that the fundamental challenge I'm exploring has a lot to do with how I feel and my feeling life, because that ultimately is about my relatedness, and that my responses to things are not expressed as thoughts, but my responses to things are expressed as feelings. I'm not sure how that is for other people, but that is my deep experience of myself. And that is, to a large part, what led me to this very interesting subject that I want to share some of my thoughts with you about. And for that to happen, I'm just going to pop up my presentation, and I hope that is that working? Are you seeing a slide that says changing our thinking? Yeah, well, that's the slide that that has the title of my talk on. It's a bit difficult to have only 20, as in, only 20 minutes to do three things. I want to tell you about this idea of becoming indigenous. I want to tell you about the business I co-founded called New Foundation Farms. And I want to tell you about myself, because it's impossible to talk about a business, I believe, independently of my person. There's a journey behind this business, and that's my journey and the journey of my co-founder, Mark Druhl. We founded this business together in 2019. Before I tell you more about that, I want to take a step back with you, because that's in a way what happened to me in 2019, or in fact in 2018. My life fell apart. My life fell apart in such a way that I got separated and divorced, and I actually quit a job without having a new one. And I was trying to find a way in life where my attitude had somehow failed me, and I didn't yet have a new attitude. And I found myself taking a great break that didn't feel quite so nice while I've entered it and while I was living through the early stages. But when I look back, what I afforded myself was the possibility of taking a step back and getting a new perspective. And that is a foundational insight at New Foundation Farms, represented through this quote by Don Campbell, a Canadian regenerative rancher. He says, if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. If you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. And I find that so compelling and true. I've tried to change my life by making little incremental changes, and without a vision, they've actually amounted to very little. But even when I seem to do nothing and look back a year, I find that my life has fundamentally changed because of a different perspective I have. This is reflected in a book by two heroes of mine, David Graeber and David Wengrow. They published this book with the unassuming title, The Dawn of Everything. But it really is the dawn of everything, because it takes us back to understanding the evolution of humanity, not as this arc that inevitably leads to city-states and that puts forward our way of consciousness, meaning white Western consciousness, as the pinnacle of evolution, but rather it's much more humble, and it points out that there have been an incredible variety of explorations of our relationship to place, and some weird and wonderful and funky ways of being, well beyond what we've ever considered before. And that leads them to this very simple conclusion, that the possibilities for human intervention are far greater than we're inclined to think. So I want to encourage you to run with your feelings and explore those as the possibility of a different way for your own life, but maybe the life of others too. So I run a business. I'm an entrepreneur. I understand my entrepreneurship also as activism. And that's really important. We talk about New Foundation Farms being a radical natural company. We are radical, but we are not revolutionaries. I describe what we do as evolutionary. What that means is that we work with what is and out of what is, not opposed to. One of the core values we have is transcend and include. Work with and together in collaboration, we can lift ourselves out of the current circumstances, even if they are very messy, intractable, and we don't quite know what to do. There's this poem by the poet Drew Dellinger, which has this key line, and I understand my entrepreneurship as an answer to the question he asks, which is, what did you do once you knew? Another way of understanding what New Foundation Farms is, before I tell you what we actually do, is to consider it a disruptor enterprise. So disruptor enterprises generally do two things. They take money and they combine it with knowledge in order to create transformation, for example, in technology, like the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy, or landline telephony to mobile telephony. And you'll often find in these major transitions that they affect far more of us than we initially expected, and they affect us in ways we hadn't even imagined. I hardly use my phone to phone people these days. I use it for all sorts of other things. I don't actually have a landline and so forth. There's a deep power in the connection of finance when it serves a different purpose. So New Foundation Farms is a disruptor enterprise that's got this radical natural vision of a different kind of a food and farming system. And we talk about what we do as a transition from an input intensive form of food and farming to a knowledge intensive approach to food and farming. This is about, instead of bringing large amounts of fertilizers involving large amounts of energy and heavy machinery and all sorts of things like that to develop monoculture crops, we believe in the knowledge that's required in order to combine lots of different crops that grow at lots of different dimensions, below the ground all the way into the treetops, with livestock in between, which is a very knowledge intensive way of doing food and farming. And so the people I work with, they're not operatives. The people I work with are knowledge workers, like I am. And when you work in this way, think about things in this way, it's sometimes called stacking enterprises. You're stacking agricultural enterprises in the field, so not just doing one thing, but you're combining lots of things, and that's called stacking, and that's represented by that circle in the middle. And then when you've done that, you recognize suddenly that instead of supplying the global supply chain with yet another commodity item, how about we process the stuff ourselves? And how about if we process it, we can also retail it ourselves, and we can have a restaurant, we can have a shop and a direct-to-home delivery. And if we do that not just once, but we do that a number of times, maybe we could build something like a disruptor brand. We call it a radical natural brand, a new story for food and farming. This sort of stacking of enterprises in the field and out of the gate involves all sorts of different ways of working with the landscape combined together. Native pollinators, cattle grazing in woodland, sheep integrated with soft fruit orchards, poultry grazing fruit and nut orchards, but not just as one-dimensional ways of doing things, but combined as well. It's quite hard to find photographs of it, which is why I'm putting them together like this, because it hasn't quite been done, certainly not where we live yet. But this isn't just about the, if you want, the living things or what we regard as living things, plants and animals together. It's also about doing it together with that which underpins life: sunlight, water, topography, gravity. The way that water makes its way down a field can also be used in a way that's called keyline design, in order to distract that water from taking the straight route down. And we can organize our crops in such a way that the water is taken away from the straight line, and it allows us to use that water for more than just washing the soil away from our fields. We can integrate arable crops with woodland. We can create a perennial matrix of trees and other perennial plants, and integrate livestock. Lots and lots of different ways to play with things. And when we play with things in that way, we might describe that as circular. But another way of talking about this is that it's about health. Health as a design approach. In the current way we think about food and farming, we are mostly guided by a yield approach. Efforts are undertaken in order to maximize the yield, and it has, by and large, two consequences. Farmers aren't the richest. Farming is an economically marginal activity. The people who make money out of farming are not farmers. The people who make money out of farming are input providers and supermarkets. Some processors do very well, and brands. In the conventional paradigm, we spend a huge amount of money in order to maximize a single crop. And we do this often with the belief that we're feeding the world, while at the same time not feeding everybody and wasting a huge amount of what's grown, with a detrimental impact on the environment where we live. When we turn this on its head, we could say, well, how about we look at health? We want a healthy system, health at all levels, and health at all levels means healthy finances as well. It's not opposed to finance. It's about transcending and including the belief that profit is important, but it's not the sole motivation. And when we do that, we end up with the idea that if every farmer feeds their community, we can feed the world. We've developed some software. This software is provocatively called cow-how. The reason for that is because cows have got a lot of bad press. My belief is that it's not the cow, it's the how. So cow-how does something I call optimizing for the symbiosis between economy and ecology. We bring together lots and lots of things, thousands of trees, lots of perennial plants, lots of livestock, lots of annual plants, and we combine them in ways that suits the topography, suits the ecology of particular sites, and we build profitable enterprises that offer employment for a lot more people than we currently employ on farms. As a measure of that, an average farm in the UK on 1,000 acres might employ 4 to 5 full-time employees. In our model, we're employing over 130 full-time employees on that same acreage, not necessarily on that land, but off that land immediately in the environment, to bring together all the jobs that are required that normally get performed elsewhere, because we see the crops leaving in a container to some anonymous, unspecific destination. When we stack our enterprises in that way, we can also stack positive impacts. And I'd like to suggest that, provocatively once more, we can stack our enterprises in such a way that they go from soil health all the way to systems change. That's emphasized by the fact that a business like ours will affect 10 out of the 17 sustainable development goals. It's reflected in the fact that the complexity of the ecosystems we steward sequester 10 tons of carbon per hectare and year, which is far beyond what we normally see in agriculture. The baseline there is at the moment 2 to 3 tons per hectare. There's something called the soil-gut-brain axis, which is the connection of soil bacteria all the way through to mental health.
We're just over halfway, Marcus. Sorry to.
Thank you so much. Keep me on track. And ultimately, when we do that, this idea of feeding the community to feed the world leads to a model that's about being place-based, growing a hyper-diverse range of produce, selling that locally, and doing that everywhere. It's a distributed approach to food and farming. Often at the moment, I hear people despairing at the mess we've made of our interaction with the planet, and it very quickly leads to this idea that humankind and nature are separate things. I think that's true to a large part, but that's not the only way to understand humans. I understand that human beings, or that at least there's the possibility for humans to be a beneficial keystone species on planet Earth. And I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to learn what that's like. I'm making baby steps in that direction. But the vision for the company, for New Foundation Farms, is that we can produce food in such a way that it is of nature. And that means that our impact with it is integrated. It is not extractive, it's not domineering, it's integrated into a system that benefits as much from our interaction as we do. The foundational consideration for this comes from someone called Alan Savory. He's the chap who created what's called holistic management. And he had this insight, which is foundational both for ecology as it is for economics, which is that the only wealth that can sustain any community, economy, or nation is derived from the photosynthetic process, green plants growing on regenerating soils. But when you look at the way we farm today, we actually seem to harvest right at the height of summer when we've got most of the sunlight, and we do it in one-dimensional ways where we've got crops that are immediately on the ground with nothing else growing in the vicinity because we're pursuing yield. So this way of thinking and describing holistic management led Alan Savory to articulate this key principle of holistic management, which is very simple. It says that a holistic perspective in management is essential. Nature functions in wholes and patterns. I think that's very intuitive, and it applies not just, in my view, to agricultural companies. In my view, that's something that everybody and every company can consider, how the wholes and patterns of nature impact their business and how their business impacts them. In ecology, it's often said that there are 4 major ecosystem processes. There are lots more, but the 4 major ones on which everything else depends are the energy cycle that brings sunlight from the sun and integrates that into the water cycle, combines it with the mineral cycle, and gives rise to biological diversity. But I want to again provocatively suggest that there are 5 ecosystem processes, because the stories we tell ourselves about, as in humans tell themselves about what we are and what the world is, they have a fundamental impact on this planet. And that's why, for example, at the moment, we describe our age as the Anthropocene. And that's not because of the ecological intelligence that we've delivered, but because of the opposite of that. 2 ways of demonstrating that. Here's one map. It's a world map according to the story of aquifers and river basins. At first, it might look like a political map, which I've got here. Lots of different colors spread over geographies. But when you compare these, you begin to see that you don't recognize the political boundaries in these water, in this water-based map of the world. There is some allusion to it, but it's a fundamentally different way of seeing our planet. Aquifers and river basins is what all life on planet Earth depends upon. This world map, the world map of human politics, has a different agenda. It leads to this idea that the opposite of a global food supply chain that deals with commodities and is designed by a yield approach is the opposite of what I call becoming indigenous. It's not global, isn't the opposite of local, because that actually, in my view, is the same thing, just in smaller. What has to change is not just the way we do side. What has to change is the world inside of us, are the stories we tell, how we feel about ourselves, how we relate to the world. So it goes beyond localism. It goes into storytelling, and storytelling, when it is of place, is essentially what the difference between being indigenous and being white Western at the moment means.
Five minutes, Marcus.
Thank you very much. So on this overview here, I'm distinguishing at the extreme end, degeneration, and regeneration at the other extreme end. And there's a long list of different things that characterize the flavor of this engagement. The degenerative side is very doing focused. It has this idea of a global supply chain. It's very linear in its, and even the word supply chain actually comes from our colonial days. The supply chain was an economic function provided by slaves. We have a technical orientation as opposed to a living orientation. It's very reductionist. It's very much about physics and chemistry as opposed to ecology and biology and so forth. And ultimately, it's imperial as opposed to collaborative. There's another way of expressing this, which talks about the amount of energy required to sustain that system. In a regenerative system, over on the far right of this image, we require least energy input, maximum sunlight, minimum fossil fuels. Over on the technical, the conventional side, where we currently are, which is where, if you're familiar with this, scope 3 emissions sit mostly over on the left-hand side of this graphic. We have to bring huge amounts of fossil fuels, and we use very little sunlight. And I'm not talking about solar panels on roofs. I'm talking about photosynthesis. And just to close this whole thing off, I might appear, you might say he talks a good game. And until recently, I wouldn't quite have had the courage to talk in the way I do. If I have a cosmic address, my cosmic address in the UK context is very far over in the adoption curve on the innovator side. However, when I zoom out and look at myself in a global context, my cosmic address is actually much further over to the right. I'm not even an early adopter. I'm part of an early majority. So much of this is happening, and we're not aware of it in the UK context. But I'm this business that I'm talking about, it is a startup business. We are only just about to go on land in Oxfordshire. We've got our computer model, we've got a team, but most importantly, we've got 17 people from around the world, from 11 countries that have invested in New Foundation Farms. And the caliber of these people and the fact that they have put money in us moved this for me from big idea to reality. And that's why I feel I can talk like this, because this is actually happening. And it's all about this idea of how might I become indigenous and change the way we do business, change the way we do life in that approach. And I'm just going to leave this by saying thank you. It's a privilege being able to talk about this.